Great. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the fourth edition of the Softball Canada 2021 webinar series. My name is Frankie Billingsley, one of the members of the Official Development Committee for Softball Canada Umpires. And tonight's fourth edition of the webinar is focused on fitness and self-care. That is the theme for the month of March. And I am super excited to introduce Dr. Amber Mosewich as our presenter for this evening. Amber focuses her research on stress, coping, and emotion in sport. A key directive of her work is to understand the psychological skills and resources necessary to facilitate successful, healthy, and positive sport experiences and how best to foster their development. Tonight, we're going to learn about the role of psychological factors in sport, along with strategies to optimize our performance and well-being. Welcome, Amber. I'm super excited to listen to you tonight. I should probably let everybody know that I've had like the best sneak preview of Amber already. Amber presented to the Edmonton Basketball Officials Association about 2 years ago, and I don't think I could write fast enough while she was presenting, and so I approached Amber after the session was over and said, I would love to have you do a session for umpires. And I was originally going to have Amber speak to the Alberta Softball Umpires Association, and then COVID happened and then I moved. So I was so thrilled that Amber agreed to do this. So Amber, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, and everything looks good. And I'll join you afterwards to facilitate the questions from the audience members.
Perfect, great. So do you see my screen?
We're good.
Perfect. All right. Thanks for the introduction, Frankie. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me tonight. I'm really excited to be here. As Frankie said, we got to meet, I guess, close to a couple of years ago now, and it's been great to facilitate just different talks and get to connect with people. So what's in store for tonight is a 20 to 25-minute presentation directed at what can be done to position ourselves to support our well-being alongside our best performance. So we're going to talk about effective coping, focus, and attention, and how to build the tools and habits to set ourselves up for success. This talk is rooted in sports psychology, which is my background. And while sports psychology has been largely directed at athletes, the skills and resources are really applicable for anyone in a high performance context in sport and beyond. So today we're going to apply the sport psych principles to you as umpires because you're in that high performance context. This is absolutely applicable to you. You all find yourself under demands at times, I'm sure, whether that be in sport or in your personal lives. And sports psych definitely has a key role in managing those demands. So keep in mind that after this presentation, we're going to have some time to talk and discuss. I can address questions, we can just chat. So please feel free to jot down questions or comments as we go along. When we talk about skill building in sports psychology, both the terms mental skills and psychological skills come up. We can use these terms interchangeably in this presentation today. What's important to remember is that in sports psych, when we think of skills, many think of the skills that are needed to promote high performance. However, these skills can promote well-being as well, and well-being definitely should never go by the wayside. If we want to truly perform at our best, we need to support well-being too. In sport, we have continuous opportunity to learn skills, apply those skills, and then better refine those skills, both in competition and in training. And sometimes this just happens, but sometimes it's squeezed in because someone thinks that it should be there. But what I'd like to emphasize today is that we all have the ability to be strategic about it. So be strategic about how we use these mental skills. When we think about mental training and building mental skills inside and outside of competition, the topic of conversation in the sport world often leads to the idea of mental toughness. Now, if we were in a live setting, I'd probably get people to put up their hand who's heard of mental toughness, who's used the term, and likely a lot of you have. But before we go any further, what exactly do I mean by mental toughness?
Amber, can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
Are you still on your title screen?
I'm not on mine.
Okay, so we are still on your title screen. So I just wanted to
Oh,
make sure, since I've seen you present before, I figured you were probably 2 or 3 slides in. Um,
I am. Okay.
okay,
Thank you. Thank you for letting me know that. Okay.
yes, you're
Let's just
welcome.
see. Oh, people can see a paused version. Okay.
Now I can see what is mental toughness.
Perfect. So now you can
So
see what is mental toughness. Right.
yes, so
Great.
maybe what I'll do,
And
I'm just gonna,
everyone, you didn't miss too much in terms of my beautiful slides to this point. So that's good. Sorry, everyone. A little bit of a different technology here. All right. Thank you, Frankie. All right. So our mental toughness. There's a lot of definitions floating around, but in some, we know that mental toughness is good. So generally, people who are mentally tough cope better than their opponents with the many demands that they have. So if we think about competition, training, lifestyle, that sport or life places on a performer. And then specifically, they're more consistent and better focused in remaining determined, focused, confident, and in control under pressure. So mental toughness is a very important component in sport, but ironically, it's kind of inadequately understood. And this is because there's been some challenges on what components to include in mental toughness. But globally speaking, if we think about what's meant by mental toughness, and if we're thinking about these psychological qualities of people who really achieve outstanding performance, this is a very key construct that needs to have some attention. So this is a quality piece. There's a lot of aspects to it. But one thing I really want to emphasize is the development piece. So there's some researchers that talk about mental toughness being caught and taught. So part of mental toughness is caught, but some aspects are taught. And what I mean here is that part of mental toughness is caught through social and developmental experiences. So critical events that we find ourselves in, perhaps supportive environments that we find ourselves in. And there's also some aspects of mental toughness that can be taught. So if we think about deliberately teaching mental skills, creating environments that are going to push us to be at our best, this can help facilitate mental toughness as well. So in an attempt to make this tidy and manageable tonight, I want us to think about it this way. When we think about mental toughness, we can think about how an individual approaches and responds to adversity or a challenge. So this is all great. There's mental toughness, there's different aspects that make us mentally tough that allow us to respond more adaptively and more consistently than others, but then how do we foster it? We know that it can be caught and taught. So I often like to show this figure because I think it does a good job of summing up some of the things that we need to think about. Bull and colleagues conducted a study with cricketers, and they were interested in the development of mental toughness. And they came up with the following model, which I think really helps to explain how we might systematically target and guide mental toughness development in ourselves or in others. And I'm going to talk about each of these briefly now. And note that there's elements and examples that are going to have some overlap if we see the titles in this triangle here. We really can't truly isolate each piece, but we need to think about what we can do to capture each piece at a more holistic level. So our thinking at the top of that pyramid influences and is influenced by our attitudes, which impacts and is impacted by our character. And that same character interacts with the environment, being shaped by it and playing a role in shaping it. So that's the environment, as well as our character, our attitudes and thinking are crucial points in consideration in the development of mental toughness. So what can we do at each level to support mental toughness? So we got to think about the environment. We need to think about our character, attitudes, and thinking, and how those all interact. If the last slide had one key takeaway for me, it's that the integration of all these components are very key. So what I do and the environment that I find myself in are both going to have an impact on how I can learn, teach, promote, support, and intervene with skills and resources designed to promote high performance and well-being. So how can we systematically develop winning minds? I'm going to back up here for a moment and talk about the sport environment. And you've probably all seen this, you've probably all heard this. The sport environment has a lot of different types of demands. We have our cognitive, emotional, situational, interpersonal, technical, tactical, physical, mental, lots of different demands. Demands can come with any situation. So we can have our success, our failure, our setbacks. It can also come with evaluation. And I'm sure everyone on this call tonight has faced a demand in one way, shape, or form. Now, the interesting thing about this sport environment is we all have these demands, but we differ in how we respond. And we do need skills and resources to respond adaptively. And sometimes these skills and resources aren't necessarily rocket science, but we do sometimes need to back up and think about what we or others need to perform effectively. And the good news is that we can teach these skills and supply these resources as well. We really can systematically put ourselves in a place to perform at a high level. Now, we can't go through all of this today, but what I've done is put through a list of key points and skills that will hopefully be of relevance to you. So I encourage you to try to integrate some of this info into your own personal situations and adapt it to your needs. And think about both performance and mental health and well-being needs. So an individualized approach when it comes to what skills you use and what skills you need is definitely going to hold the most potential. And think about what you need to perform at your best and also have high levels of well-being. So we can do things like self-talk or imagery and visualization, focus planning to ensure that we're organized and our attention is where it needs to be. Maybe we need to pump ourselves up with some energizing techniques or down-regulate with some relaxation techniques. Goal setting is really huge and can help provide a structure for what we want to achieve in the future, but also structure how we use our psychological skills. And then two really big ones that I'll talk about a little bit more today are motion regulation and then our concentration and attention strategies. Now, we also need to consider what we need for optimal mental health. And I alluded to this on the last slide. Now, remember, supporting mental health is not just about intervening when there's a problem. Mental health is just like physical health. There's steps that we can take to position us to be in a more optimal state of mental health. So just like we might ensure that we get regular exercise and eat well to support our physical health, there are things we can do to ensure that we're engaging in self-care, doing things that support our mental health. One thing that I always say to the high performers that I work with is don't limit yourself to just addressing the negatives. We can work to enhance the positives as well. And this will help build your capacity over time. So think of both like your physical fitness, the tactical and technical knowledge that you need, as well as your mental fitness. So we do need to pay attention to the mental side of the game and enhance the positives and don't just deal with the negatives. A major key for both performance and well-being is self-awareness. So, for example, think of mental prep for games. It's probably not that easy to do. I can't say that I have been an umpire in a softball game, but I can't imagine it's that easy to do. We need to become aware of what you need, how to get what you need, and being both aware of what you need and how to get it is really crucial. You may have the answers, you may know what you need, you may know how to get it, but you may need to seek out some information there. But know that that information is there for you. It might be in a community such as this one that we're chatting tonight. It might be with someone with sports psych expertise. It might be another colleague. But the start of it all is learning to understand ourselves, what our strengths, challenging areas, and needs are, We really try to capitalize on our strengths and seek improvement or solutions as well. So we all have places where we could improve, but we also all have strengths that we can really try to harness. We can't forget that piece. We need to understand both the physical and the psychological resources to help us strive for potential. Self-awareness can help to direct our attention and focus, which impacts our activation levels and helps us to regulate them. And then it also helps with stress management. Now, in terms of our regulation and our management strategies, there's a ton of them. There's a ton of things that we can do to manage our emotions, maybe down regulate our emotions, up regulate them, manage or cope with different situations. There's tons. But the key really is to explore your options and then pay attention to how effective it was. And now this is one spot where it's like, well, yeah, of course we need to pay attention to where it was. But research and my own applied practice has shown that sometimes people generate a lot of ideas to help themselves, and they're all good ideas, but then they miss that really important piece in following up to evaluate how effective it was for them and making individualized tweaks to make it continue to work or work better for them in the future. Now, regulation and management are very closely linked to attention. And I put this in this top today because I imagine attention is a very important piece of what you all do as umpires. And there's many items that we could attend to when we're in a game situation or some other demanding situation. And obviously not all of the information enters our conscious experience. And it's ideal if what enters is relevant. So we need to withdraw from some to better attend to others. And despite what we think about being good multitaskers, being good at dividing our attention, we do only have so much attentional capacity to go around. So we want to be focusing on what's relevant to us. We need to think of attention as a multidimensional construct. And part of attention is our concentration. So this is our deliberate decision to invest mental effort on something that seems important at the time. We also have selective perception, so our ability to zone in on task relevant information while ignoring distractions. And then finally, we have our divided attention. So extensive practice will allow some actions to be performed concurrently. So oftentimes these concurrent actions are perhaps well-learned, more automated tasks. So what causes a loss of concentration or poor attention? Well, distractions, we've all had them, and they can be internal or external. And they are going to happen. So part of this right now, I'd like you to just reflect and consider how well you bounce back from a mistake. So if you're in a demanding situation, a mistake could be considered a distraction, right? Or maybe a distraction caused a mistake or led to a mistake. How well do you bounce back? This is really important because this bounce back is an indicator of your attentional capacity as well, because it's part of you recognizing a mistake, rectifying if possible or needed, and then refocusing on what's happening in the future and not ruminating on the past. Because again, remember that divided attention. If we're going to use divided attention, it's not worth ruminating and taking up a piece of that attentional pie on what happened in the past. Yes, you might have to review it and address it after, but if it's not going to help you in the present moment, we need to be able to narrow down and focus. So we need to know our distractors. We can practice within them, that's great. So if we can set things up that mirror what we find distracting, great, if we can do some practice. If we can't, we can also make some plans for them. So sort of like an if then. If this distractor happens, this is what I'm going to do to try to cope with it. We need to think about whether it's possible to eliminate a distractor, which might be possible, or is it more of a matter of management? So is a distractor around not finding some of our key equipment that we need before an event, well, that could be a matter of eliminating that if we had an organized focus plan that had us getting to a place maybe a little bit early with certain things organized in certain places. But then there's other things like perhaps the fans. Like it's probably more of a management. We can't eliminate the fan base. Setting both performance and process goals are really important. Oftentimes we set outcome goals. So an outcome goal is exactly what it sounds like, sort of that outcome. So for an athlete, it's often a win or loss, but it's really just anchored to the end result. Performance and process goals are more strung along in terms of our own development and can provide us with a little bit more control, because sometimes with those end result goals, we don't have complete control over them. But if we're focusing on our performance, so what we're doing relative to our past performance, or our process, so how things are sequentially moving from one place to another, we have more control over that. Think about pre-performance and performance routines. So how can we get into an optimal place of focus and preparation before the competition begins? And this may have some rituals that you do. It may have warm-ups in terms of physical and psychological, like mental skills. But typically with a lot of high performers, they'll have a set warm-up, and not just physical warm-up, but they'll have a set of strategies that they do every time to get themselves in a place of optimal focus. And this pre-performance can be once they arrive at the competition venue, but there may be pre-performance activities that happen even before that. So the day of, the night before, that kind of thing. There's also performance routines. Once the performance or once the competition has started, there are things that you can build in. So maybe between innings, there's something that you want to do to make sure that you're resetting and checking in on your focus level. Cue words and visualization or imagery can be really fast strategies to remind yourself to be focused on what you need to. In terms of approaches for attention, we need to decide to concentrate. We need to be able to switch on and switch off. And I've had some really interesting conversations with athletes, but I think it's very relevant in terms of officials and umpires as well. The switching on and switching off is an important skill. We can't pay 100% attention, or we can't have 100% concentration all of the time. And if you are going to be an umpire for a number of games in a day, for example, being able to effectively switch off after that game is going to be very key. And then snapping yourself back to attention when it's go time again is great. Because if we're using attention up, again, it's a capacity thing. It will get tougher as the day goes on. So we can conserve resources. It's definitely key. Try to think of one thought or focus at a time. An exception is if we have automatic, well-learned skills, we can do those alongside what we're really focused on. And if we do what we think, it increases congruence. So that's kind of more of a motor learning type tip in there. Mindfulness can also help enhance our attentional capacity. If any of you are interested in mindfulness, I can speak to it a little bit in the Q&A afterwards. And I can also direct you to some resources too. Focus outwards when you're anxious rather than inwards on your doubts, but focus on what you can control. And we need to ensure that we manage self-criticism, because when we're in demanding situations, a lot of people will default to self-criticism to either enhance their performance or punish themselves for mistakes. But remember, there's a difference between constructive evaluation and excessive self-criticism. There's a lot of challenges with criticism that's less than constructive. It actually, self-criticism that is harsh and not constructive leads to more procrastination, less responsibility for mistakes, less personal initiative, more guilt and shame. And people who engage in a more constructive evaluation, so acknowledge that there's an issue and figure out how to rectify it, versus excessive self-criticism, which tends to be more berating, less objective and directed towards problem solving, and more ruminative. is less effective. Our emotions and our thoughts have an impact too. So keep in mind that our thoughts are going to impact how we feel, and how we feel impacts how we behave or how we act. So that's emotion and activation. Why do we care? Well, when we have our emotions in balance, what happens? Just think about that for a second. When your emotions are in a balance, what happens, especially in terms of your performance? And when we're at the best activation levels for us, what happens? So really, we perform at our best when we have those ideal emotional and activation levels. And these differ for everyone. So here I've got an example up on the screen, 3 umpires. Some perform best at a low level of activation and emotion, some at a more moderate level, and some at a higher level. So I'd like you to consider what your optimal level is. Where do you perform the best in terms of your activation level, in terms of different emotions? So where do you perform best in terms of excitement levels, anxiety levels, maybe contentment levels? So here's a few strategies for managing our emotions and our activations. We can use self-talk and imagery, social support, focus planning, pre and post competitive routines, mindfulness, and relaxation and energizing techniques. Our appraisals are really important. So these are our perceptions. And people often view anxiety and other emotions in different ways. So some will see a bit of anxiety. I'm not talking about clinical anxiety here. I'm talking about more of the emotion of anxiety. It's very harmful. So they're way too nervous and they see it as very debilitative. But some see it as a level of good nervous, like facilitative. And this is an important distinction to make. And high performers quite often see some of their negative emotions as facilitative, as a sign that they care, as a sign that they're ready. So in addition to emotion management and regulation, we need to consider acceptance of some emotions as well. So if you're if you're the umpire for a very important game, or maybe it's your first game out in a while, it'd be very, very normal and expected to have some level of nervousness or anxiety. And yes, we can try to regulate that to an ideal level, but it may not be realistic to completely eliminate that. Because that emotion tells us that something's at stake and that you care. So emotions are a common and expected experience, and we can regulate them to try to have them work for us. But we also need to remember that they're a normal, natural, common human occurrence, and we can't expect to eliminate them all. So we need to think about what Jack Donahue, he's a former head coach of the Canadian national basketball team, I think he puts it really well. So it's not a case of getting rid of the butterflies, it's a question of getting them to fly in formation. So in terms of managing emotions, it's not a case of getting rid of them, it's a case of getting them to work for you. So I'll just wrap up here now. I'll leave you with these 2 key terms, our self-awareness and our self-regulation. We need to have areas to attend to, so be aware of where we need to support ourselves, and then a plan on how to manage that, our self-regulation. So if you're unsure of where to start, you might monitor some of your reactions to identify different triggers that you might want to try to manage, and then move to thinking about how you might respond to them more effectively. And remember that evaluation piece after. If you try a plan, make sure that you look back to see and look for evidence as to how effective it was. And remember, just like physical fitness, mental fitness takes time to develop and needs continued attention. You wouldn't expect physical changes to happen overnight, but in time they do happen. So the same goes for the psychological side. It does take some time and effort, but it's worth it. And after all, we spend a ton of time on the physical, technical, tactical sides of sport. So we can give ourselves an additional edge by ensuring the psychological side is there too. Thank you very much. And we can open it up for questions now.
Amber, thank you so much. Oh, I could listen to you forever. I bet you wish your university students said that.
Yeah.
No, honestly, that slide about the optimal level, everybody being at different parts of the spectrum of activation and emotion has just hit me like such a ton of bricks, because many of the people that you're speaking to tonight and people that will listen to the recording later will go to championships and be in a group of people that they're just getting to know for the first time. And it is helpful, and that is actually a really helpful thing to know about other people that you're going to be working with, is what their optimum level is, and everybody's is different. So actually just knowing that is really, really helpful. Before I get to the questions, I just wanted to throw this little tidbit out there. For a lot of people that are listening tonight, they've progressed in their careers, and they're at a point where perhaps the nerves and such are at a quite a high level. But I'd like everybody here to remember what it was like when they called balls and strikes in their very first game. Like all of those things that you're talking about tonight, Amber, are pronounced for people who are just starting their officiating career. And their first few seasons elicit all of those responses that you were talking about that are really hard for them to control. And then you've got on top of that sometimes their partner or somebody who's watching is trying to help them, but in helping them might actually be like adding to their nervousness, because it's like information overload, right? So anyway, that just really stood out to me, because a lot of the people that are here are in positions where they're now turning around and helping other people grow.
Well, and that's fantastic. So yeah, I think reflecting on how you develop some of those skills, and then think about how we deliver that information, right? And what someone might need. So that zones of optimal functioning, right? Like what does this performer need? Do they need to down regulate or up regulate a little bit in terms of their activation or emotional level? And then that's great to hear that a lot of people on this call will have strategies to keep their emotions at a good point. So think about what it is that you do that's really effective. And then when you are in a situation where maybe focus isn't quite there, or there's a demand, and it may not be a performance demand, it may be a general life demand, we can use these strategies. And that, I think, links to the well-being component. Like, we can do this stuff in our day-to-day lives to keep ourselves sharp and well, and that facilitates performance too.
For sure. And interestingly enough, even though there's a lot of experience from the audience members on the call, the mental side of the game is not something that Softball Canada we haven't spent a lot of time delving into. In fact, it's not really something that we talk about until people are 3/4 of the way through their developmental journey. So we have 5 levels that umpires progress through. And the 4th level is the one where we start talking about the psychology of officiating, but the mental side of the game is not something we talk about until then. And I would suggest that even for people that have progressed and gotten to like really, really high levels, learning how to be the best version of yourself mentally is not necessarily something that's easy to learn. So my first question to you would be, so if a person is new to using mental skills, what skills should they focus on first?
What I typically suggest is people almost do like a strengths and needs inventory. So think about, we never want to overlook our strengths and what we have in our toolbox already. So making a list of some of the things that we do quite well. So maybe we have some strategies to refocus. Maybe we have an ability to calm down when we're overactivated. But then in a needs assessment, we may find that there's some areas that we want to work on. So maybe we find it challenging to bounce back after a mistake, or deal with feedback from colleagues effectively. And in identifying those things that we want to work on, we can then set goals around how to progress with them. So it's one thing to identify something you want to work on, but you need a plan in place to develop those. That's where I say, like, something like this forum that you have here, there's a wealth of knowledge and experience. So if someone was looking to sharpen a skill in a certain area, there may be tons of expertise here and ideas to direct some development. You may have the answer already, though, for yourself on where to look. And then you could also reach out to sports psych professionals or other performance professionals, or there's a lot of resources even online in terms of sharpening those types of skills. So I mentioned like mindfulness, for example. It's really taken the world by storm, and we're seeing it integrated into a lot of school programs. And like, these are things that our youth are learning, but we never learned growing up, so it's quite new to us, but they are making things like that a bit more accessible too.
So have you ever been presented with somebody that really didn't feel like they had any strengths in this area at all, and they were starting out from just scratch? So they can't deregulate, they get stressed out and can't manage it, they don't have a plan, they don't know what self-talk is, they don't understand what imagery is or visualization. Like, what do you do with that kind of athlete?
Right. So in that situation, I really think like ideally, it's ideal if you can connect with someone who works in sports psych, but the reality is that that's not possible for everyone. But if you were mentoring someone, you might even walk them through, get them to tell you about a time when something to do with their performance went quite well. So what happened? What did you do? How did you respond? What were you thinking? What were you feeling? What were you doing? What did you do leading up to it? And kind of unpack that, because likely there are some strengths that people have, which can be quite motivating if people are like, oh, no, I'm just a lost cause, because no one is a lost cause. We can learn all of these skills. Sometimes we need to learn more than others. We definitely can learn these skills. So getting them to think about a time when things went really well and what they did can identify some strengths. Another way to integrate kind of a strengths-based approach is if there's something that they want to work on. So perhaps it is relaxing the night before the game. Maybe they really get worried about calling a game the next day and they're having trouble sleeping, having trouble relaxing. You could brainstorm with them and have them come up with some ideas too, showing that they do have capacity within themselves to generate some relaxation ideas. And we often use this in a lot of behavior change strategies. So like with exercise, if someone's seeking out to begin a new exercise program, it can be really efficient and effective to have them take part in that decision-making and planning process and generate those ideas. Because there's a lot of different things you can do to be physically active, and there's a lot of different things you can do to relax. But we build that competence, like, yes, I can think of some things, and then autonomy, like I'm doing this on my own, I am capable of generating these ideas as well. So getting them to be a partner in the solution as well. So empowering them in that way.
Perfect. Why do you think people have such varied emotional responses?
I mean, it comes down to that, those varied emotional responses come down to that appraisal bit. So when I was talking about appraisals or our perceptions, we're all obviously in the same situation, but we're not seeing it all exactly the same way. We all have different past experiences. We all have different expectations for that event. We all have different roles probably within that event. And it can lead to different experiences within the same situation. So if I give an athlete example here, I might be coaching a team of athletes, and there may be a new competitive situation, new venue, new team, and one athlete might perceive that as a challenge and they're really ready to go. One might be more indifferent, and one might be really, really anxious about it. And it depends how they're looking at the situation, and oftentimes that has to do with the appraisal level of like a challenge. Are we seeing this as a challenge? Are we seeing this as a threat? Are we seeing the potential for loss or harm? Right? So, and that loss or harm bit, I think, is really relevant for umpires as well, because often you're being evaluated. So there's that harm loss piece there too, and that threat piece. So we all bring different things to a situation, different past experiences. So that can really lead to different emotional reactions. And then couple that with different abilities to regulate ourselves. The other thing we need to remember is younger people are still learning how to regulate, and these are skills that often like children are learning, adolescents are learning, but even if you think of the emerging adults, they're still learning what works for them too, and then sometimes adults as well. And they do have different abilities to cope, and then different capacities at times too. If someone's really under a lot of demands in other areas of their life, they may have a more difficult time dealing with the situation, and it may surprise you. Like their reaction might be completely different than what you know of them typically. And I think maybe a lot of us in the last year have seen this a little bit. There's been times where I know some people in my life have responded completely different to what I might have anticipated, but there were some unique circumstances with the pandemic, and people don't always respond exactly how you expect.
This is actually really, I think, a critical point for some of the listeners, because when you talk about athletes in the context of their emotional responses, many people who are listening and will listen after are bringing crews of umpires together to officiate at provincial championships, Western championships, Easterns, Canadians, and so this piece is helpful for them to understand that everyone's going to respond differently to the things that happen as the championship unfolds. So that's really, so that leads me to how can someone learn more about the emotional profile of the people that they're interacting with?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing I'll say is, like, in terms of the emotional profile, like you can, if you're in a mentorship situation or a place where you're trying to support a colleague, oftentimes asking what they need or how you can support is a good way to go. It does require a bit of rapport building, right? Like if you've just met someone, it may be difficult to open up and say like, oh, what you need in this moment. But what I would say is observe. You may notice some tendencies, because there are definitely traits that people have in terms of their responses and their behaviors that are somewhat consistent over time. But then with the caveats, people might surprise you. Like, you just don't assume. So you might have a hot-headed colleague, or you might have a very introverted colleague, but they may break that norm at times too. So I would say pay attention and don't assume. If you are reaching out to help out, maybe even ask what you could do to help if you're in that point with rapport, right? Like in that support giving.
Nice, thank you. I'm hogging the questions here. I'm gonna turn to some of the questions that are in the, so I think you might have touched on this, but I'll just see if you have anything to add. What would you consider to be the single most important psychological skill in becoming a better performer or umpire? Is this question more personal than general in nature?
Well, I do think, like, I like that you've acknowledged the personal or general in nature, because there are skills and resources that some people might gravitate towards to some more than others. So some may like imagery and focus planning, and someone else may like self-talk and goal setting. But the single most important skill, in my opinion, and I feel as though I have research to back that up, is being able to self-regulate, being able to regulate how our emotions go, being able to regulate our attention, being able to regulate responses. And so part of that is a control and change. So having the skills to control and change emotions, or maybe redirect behaviors. And another really important skill that I think has gotten overlooked a lot in sports psychology, but is getting more attention now, is that acceptance piece. So there are times where we just have to accept that things are what they are, and keep moving forward and not letting it throw us. Our emotions don't always have to drive the bus, so to speak. And so sometimes we need to accept that there is some degree of uncontrollability, but the regulation piece, I think, is very key. So great question. Thank you for that.
I would just have a comment from one of our illustrious evaluators. All very good suggestions for evaluators and instructors. I took a pile of notes, so I just thought I'd share that with you. How do we deal with the curveball when you get unexpected response?
You get an unexpected response. So would this be an unexpected response from someone else? I'm taking it, maybe?
I'm assuming so. So
Yeah,
maybe
okay.
someone who's in a situation where they're maybe providing feedback to somebody and they just like totally get something they weren't expecting. So I'm assuming that the evaluator knows the umpire well enough to presume a certain approach will work, and they get like a snapshot of what was that?
Yeah, great question. Because sometimes this can happen, right? Like people have these typical ways of responding, but it's never, humans are never completely predictable. So yes, you might have some feedback or an interaction that goes completely not as expected. One strategy I have is thinking ahead about the different ways things might go and having like a plan to maybe redirect the conversation. So if it's about giving feedback, you could set out a couple little feelers, put out the line and see if that's the time to talk about it. And then you could always redirect that after. Anytime we give feedback, especially if someone's in a heightened emotional state, they're often not in a place where they can process it effectively. So I would say, like, not to put this all on the evaluator, but if you do find things aren't being taken the way you expected, just consider perhaps what sort of emotional state that person's in, what kind of attentional capacity they likely have left, and think about what feedback needs to be given then and what could perhaps wait until the person has a bit more mental clarity. And I do this, I'm going to give an example that maybe everyone can relate to. Likely everyone's written a test at some point in their life and maybe they've gotten it back and they didn't get the grade or mark that they expected. I'll encourage my students, I just say 24-hour rule. We'll talk about it in 24 hours. And it's not that I don't want to talk to them about it. I'm happy to talk to them about their exam, but our conversation is so much more constructive once they are in a place where they don't have heightened emotion, they've had some time to process what's happened, and then we can come back and have that back and forth. So Frankie, maybe you can fill me in on like the ability to maybe have, there's like, I imagine some points where a back and forth has to happen right then. And then there may be other times where that conversation can maybe be had in more depth at a later date.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, actually. There's knowing your audience, knowing the way that they're receiving the information, and knowing what does this official need in the immediate sense for their very next game, let's say, and what can perhaps wait until later. So that's great advice. We've got another audience question. Where would you go to? Oh, she's got it. So we will post this on YouTube for those that want to watch it again later. No problem. You'll get an email. It'll be posted on the Softball Canada Umpires YouTube channel. What are some in-game techniques for focus, i.e. after a disputed call or unexpected reaction from a player or coach?
Perfect, I love it. So this is where I think the cueing is so important. And this can be like a self-talk cue. So you could have a word or a quick phrase that's linked strongly to your performance planning. So that pre-performance routine and competition routine that I was speaking about. So phrases that remind you to relax, or phrases that help you to regulate your emotions. I actually worked with one official that did, there can be like little subtle even behavioral reminders. So at the double tap to the thigh, even just a quick double tap as just a mental reminder to, well, I guess it's kind of mental and physical reminder to reset and refocus. So I find these cues that make you disconnect from perhaps the current issues, the disputed call or the negative interaction with a coach or a player, something that resets your mind to calling that next pitch. That tends to be quite effective. Some people find a quick breath effective as well. And all of these can be done with no one knowing that it's happening as you walk back to your position. So those I find to be quite effective. What I suggest is wherever possible, practice this kind of stuff in a lower stakes situation first, and then build up to the higher stakes, because they do take some practice. And then with umpires, I would say you could try these strategies too in your everyday lives to practice for the sport performance. So maybe it's work, maybe it's with family or friends or something, but you could practice in a non-sport setting to build some of that skill as well.
Awesome, thank you, Amber. And we did get clarity from the person who was asking about the interaction that didn't go well, and that's exactly what they were alluding to, that they're giving. So, and they said, you know, thanks for the comments, and that was helpful. How could an umpire set up their own kind of psychological support plan?
Great question. So I'd start with that strengths and the needs assessment. And I would say start on the small side. So look at what a few of your strengths, how could you use them even more to your advantage? And where are a couple things where you want to, what are a couple things that you want to address, and set some goals around that. And you may need to information gather. So perhaps it's you want to set up a pre-performance routine. You may need to look into what might be included in a pre-performance routine, or what might be helpful for you. So I would start with just including a couple of things, build it into a routine, and then you'd be amazed that athletes will start with a couple of things, and then more needs are identified, and then you just build from there. So make it manageable at first. I would say try to address maybe 2 or 3 needs, and work on maybe for learning a little bit about the strategy. So perhaps you want to use self-talk for attention, or maybe you want to use goal setting or set up a pre-performance plan. Dig around a little bit, find some research. I've been really happy to see a bit more online that's specific for officials. This is a population that I can't believe it took so long to really take hold, because the pressure that officials, umpires are under is just tremendous. Just they got forgotten about for a long time. So there are some resources out there, but you could even look at stuff for athletes or coaches and adapt it to yourself.
You know, I know a big one that people talk about is like the imagery and visualization, and I think I'm not sure people really can break it down to understand how to learn how to do it. Like I think it's almost one of those things where, you know, you could probably get a group of 10 people in a class and have them close their eyes and just like walk people through it. Do you have any tips for people if they're just trying to figure out how to do that?
Yeah, for sure. So I say start with assessing where you're at with your imagery. Some people are really strong visualizers and some less so, but again, it's one of those things where you practice and you get stronger. And I would even just find a recording, or think of something that you want to imagine. Maybe it's a favorite place, or maybe it's your childhood bedroom, something like that. And rate how vivid your image is and how controllable it is. And that controllability piece is really important in sport, because we don't want to start throwing in sport scenarios if we don't have controllability over our images, because we don't want to start imagining negative things. But in terms of that vividness, don't just think about how sharp and vivid the image is in terms of the visual cue. Strong visualizers or imagers will bring in all of the senses. So they'll be able to hear things, smell things. They'll even have kind of a taste and a kinesthetic element. And likely, if you assess yourself in this way, there'll be different senses that you can readily pick out. So I often, if I'm doing an imagery session with some people involved in sport, I'll often do, they'll walk through the snow and hear it crunching under their feet, or they'll hear the wind, feel the cold. I'll have them bite into a lemon, like how many of you could taste it? And if there's people in the room with their eyes closed, some will even make a face. But different people will be able to conjure up those different senses in a different way. So if you find you rate a little bit lower on something like the sound or the audible sense. Practice trying to hear things, be really purposeful to prompt yourself to integrate that part of it into your image that you're trying to create. And the other tip I have is, this is a really fun one, because if I'm in a group, I'll get people to imagine themselves doing something, and then I'll ask how many people saw it through their own eyes. So like through their own eyes, kind of first person, and how many people watched it from a third person perspective, like they were on TV. And we probably get half and half, which I think is so cool. And some people switch back and forth, but we need to practice both of that. So if you're using imagery and if you're visualizing yourself in a game, see it from your own eyes, but also see it from the stands, see it from the baseline, see it from the picture. So definitely look at it from different perspectives as well. So those are a few imagery tips.
That's so cool. Thank you. My last question, and I think we've addressed all of the questions from the audience. And again, I don't even think I went back to my basketball meeting. I think I just spent my whole time talking to you after you were done presenting that night when we met a few years ago. I mean, I could talk to you forever. My last question is the correlation that you see between resilience and mental toughness. I mean, I don't know if you used that word, I didn't hear it, but I'm thinking about that notion of caught mental toughness that you talked about. And I'm thinking that people that have had really significant challenges in just life generally, and then they end up, whatever they do professionally or in their hobbies, they have this really like a tenacity and a determination about them that I think comes from their resilience from being through these other trials and tribulations. And I'm wondering if, do you see that?
Absolutely. So if we're looking at correlational research, mental toughness or variables that are associated with mental toughness tend to show a high correlation with resilience. And I didn't use that term today, but it's the one that resonates most strongly with my research program. So I want people involved in sport to have the skills and resources to respond adaptively, to have the resilience needed to perform at their best and also maintain high levels of well-being while they're pursuing their goals. So yes, mental toughness correlates highly with resilience. And if that term resonates with someone, like that is really at the crux of what we need in a high performance setting. There's going to be ups and downs. We need to be able to bounce back, to persevere. And those mental toughness attributes can contribute to that, as well as the mental skills that we talked about today.
Well, thank you so much, Amber, for joining us tonight. I think some really great golden nuggets for people to take away, especially just that whole concept of, we spend so much time talking about physical preparedness. Shouldn't we focus just as much time on our mind and mentally preparing? So I really love that. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise with us. It's very rare that we have someone with your background chatting with us about anything. So thank you. And to those of you who are with us tonight, thank you for your questions and your time. And please join me in the month of April for communication. Sometimes when a coach comes to talk to us, that's when we have challenges with regulating our emotions. And so what a great segue into our next month's theme, which is communication. And our first webinar will be on April 12th, Communication, a Coach's Perspective, where we will be joined by Andrea Wolf, who's coached numerous teams, including Canada Summer Games teams, and our head coach from the Canadian women's softball team, Mark Smith. So until then, we will sign off. And Amber, thank you again for your time. What a lovely hour.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me. And I did throw my email up on the screen there if anyone has follow-up questions. So thanks so much for having me, everyone, and all the best.
Oh, we got such great comments. So yes, thanks, Amber. Take care, everyone. Bye.